Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed. Grab a pen and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habarigani. This is Sister Thade with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, December 7th, 2024. We support the voice for the voiceless, the 99%. And today we bring you a special fund drive program covering Black women's scholarship on both African Americans abroad in the Nordic region and on Black resistance. Our agenda for today: we commence with our ancestor, Didan Kamati, in the African Drumbeat historical calendar. Then, this hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Professor Ethelene Whitmire of the African American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and co-editor of the book Nordic Utopia, African Americans in the 20th Century. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Associate Professor Kellie Carter Jackson of Africana Studies at Wellesley College in Massachusetts and author of the book We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Tad Jones, Quincy Jones, George Benson, Miles Davis, and more. We are in Fund Drive, and so if you're just tuning in to KPFK for the first time, welcome. You can become a member of the station with a pledge of $25 to KPFK. And so here's some background also for our listeners about why we're asking for your support today to donate. KPFK began broadcasting to the Los Angeles, Southern California community in 1959. They moved their transmitter site to Mount Wilson in January of 1964, and KPFK has one of the most powerful FM signals in the Western United States. In the second half of 2012, KPFK purchased a solid-state transmitter to replace one of the aging dual vacuum tube transmitters, which were combined to meet its full licensed broadcast power. And early in 2014, they bought the second solid-state transmitter. And each of these two transmitters are now at least 10 years old, and replacement parts are expensive. Electronics can fail at any time, sometimes without warning. And so KPFK is asking you to donate to its transmitter fund so we can purchase replacement parts, which will allow us to continue broadcasting at full power. Please donate by calling or going online to our website. The number to call is 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735. And our website is www.kpfk.org. So sit back, enjoy the program, contribute what you can, and as always, we stand ready for revolution.
are racists about. Watch out, there are racists about. Me tell you no, watch out, there are racists about. Them in the east, them in the west, them in the north, them in the south, them over the road, them down the lane, and them they round about. And out of this was them just a crawl out, and them talking the excrement from out of them out. When them break down the wall, them in a Germany, the ones from the gate, and them they round about. And out of this was them just a crawl out, and them talking the excrement from out of them out. When them break down the wall, them in a Germany, the ones from Europe come together in a 92. Good for them, but me don't know about me and you. Like the skin and them a come true, but they say we not run. Them the deal.
Hotep, this is Brother Dion with the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for this week of December 5th. Our sister Luanda is in South Africa, so I'm taking over. On December 5th, 1958, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, the anti-colonial leader and first Prime Minister of Ghana, convenes the All-African People Conference. This conference fulfills Nkrumah's inaugural pledge that the independence of Ghana means nothing as long as African people anywhere were oppressed. The conference objective was globally to coordinate the decolonization and the de-neocolonization of Africa and African people worldwide. Within a 10-year period, over 70% of African countries gained independence from colonialism. December 6, 1961, Frantz Fanon, Pan-Africanist, Caribbean-born, French-educated staff psychologist for the French Colonial Army's Division of Interrogations in Algiers, dies. Frantz Fanon committed class suicide and became a member of the National Liberation Front of Algeria and a prolific writer on the psychology of colonialism. His most famous book, The Wretched of the Earth, became the Bible of the psychology of the oppressed and oppressor, as well as the books Black Skins, White Masks. December 6, 1990, Melchora Aquino, revolutionary Filipino independence activist, crosses over. She was imprisoned for providing weapons, storage, and communications to the anti-Spanish resistance forces seeking to gain independence from Spanish colonial rule of the Philippines. December 7, 1987, the Palestinian Intifada, national uprising begins in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip, heralding another phase in the decolonization struggle of the Palestinians against the Israeli settler colony called Israel. December 7, 1971, Libya, under the revolutionary leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, nationalizes the oil fields controlled by British Petroleum. December 8, 1995, Sister Toni Cade Bambara crosses over to the ancestor world. Toni stated, "It is a duty, it is a responsibility of the writer to represent an oppressed people, to make revolution irresistible." Toni, an African born in America, she's a revolutionary socialist, Pan-Africanist, author, and lecturer. December 9, 1961, Tanganyika gains independence in Mwalimu Nyerere under the banner of socialism and unites with the African island of Zanzibar, creating Tanzania in one of the many efforts of building a United States of Africa. December 11, 1895, Dolores Imbaru, nicknamed La Pasonera, quotes, "Better to die on your feet than on your knees. They shall not pass." The most famous and important Spanish communist of the 20th century, who founded the Spanish Communist Party in 1920, as well as organized miners, and was a leader in the Spanish Civil War against the fascist Franco dictatorship. December 10, 1956, a movement for the liberation of Angola is founded and leads the people of Angola in a fierce armed war against Portuguese colonialism and against the racist South African regime and the United States' effort to recolonize Angola. Cuba provides military support to assist Angola in driving back U.S.-backed racist South African troops. December 12, 1977, the Geneva Convention was revised and the rules of war is signed, giving guerrillas the same rights as uniformed soldiers during the war. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Any comments, inputs, whatever, please contact us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. And as always, we say, Amandala await to, Amandala await to, Amandala await to.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Ethelene Whitmire, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and co-editor of the book Nordic Utopia, African Americans in the 20th Century. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Ethelene Whitmire.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
This book is a catalog that goes along with the exhibition of the same name, Nordic Utopia, African Americans in the 20th Century. And this exhibit started at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle. It's currently at the Chasen Museum at the University of Wisconsin. And it will end at the Scandinavia House in New York City in March of 2025. And this book and the exhibition is an outgrowth of the research that I conducted about African Americans in Denmark in the 20th century. And we've expanded that to include the other Nordic countries. So Scandinavian countries comprise of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. And for Nordic, it also encompasses Iceland and Finland. So we have 4 of the 5 in this exhibition and catalog. We don't include Iceland in the exhibition.
So how did you get interested in this topic?
It was on a whim. This started about 14 years ago in 2010 at the end of my first sabbatical. I had a year off and it was getting a little boring and I wanted to travel longer than just a few days. And so for 2 months, I went to Denmark on a whim. I was watching a lot of Danish films and I decided to rent an apartment in Copenhagen. Loved it. I've been back a total of 18 times. But over the years, I started encountering, whether in text, but literally in a cemetery, information about African Americans who had been in Denmark. I lived one summer by a famous cemetery, Assistens Kierkegaard, where Soren Kierkegaard, the philosopher, is buried, and Hans Christian Andersen is also there. And the rental agency said it's a nice, very interesting place where Danes bicycle, picnic, jog through. I don't do any of that in cemeteries, but I took it as a shortcut to a cafe's. And on the way back, I noticed a grave of the name Ben Webster. And I knew it wasn't a Scandinavian name. And I was curious, who is Ben Webster and why is he there? I had no idea he was a very famous jazz musician, an African-American jazz musician. And I discovered there were 2 more jazz musicians, African-American, buried behind him. Turns out it's a jazz section of a cemetery. And there's probably about a dozen buried throughout the city. And I started just hearing bits and pieces about African Americans in Denmark. I knew a lot about James Baldwin and Langston Hughes and Richard Wright in Paris, but I had never heard this story about African Americans who went to Denmark and other Scandinavian countries to perform, to tour, and eventually to live.
Now, Denmark has had a, shall we say, a contradictory relationship with Black people. For example, the U.S. Virgin Islands were originally colonized by the Danes, and in fact was not, quote, sold, unquote, to the United States until about 1917. And of course, there were enslaved Africans throughout the Virgin Islands, and there was a major slave revolt taking place there about 160 years ago. So is there any recognition in Denmark of this sordid history?
Well, it's interesting. Again, I've been going there 14 years, and I happened to live there in 2016, 2017 as a Fulbright. In 2017, the 100th anniversary of the sale of the islands to the United States, Denmark decided to recognize this past in terms of their colonization. A lot of people were not aware at all because they left the Black people on the islands. And so it was almost an unknown history. Many people had no idea. And so there's a movement, there's a Black Lives Matter movement there. There are a lot of young activists and artists who are of Black descent and who are very interested in bringing this history out. And the museums throughout Denmark during 2017, they wanted to commemorate this fact, and there were exhibits, there were different events. Most importantly, there was a statue, the first statue recognizing a Black person in Denmark. It was called the I Am Queen Mary statue, representing one of the women who revolted and helped fire burn queens, they're known as, on the islands. And so this statue was created with a Black Danish artist and a Black woman also from the islands. It has since fallen down. The base is still there, and you can still find out information about it. But again, throughout there were statues. There was a statue of a famous a newspaper man who they have a day named after him. That's in the Workers' Museum. He helped fight for workers' rights. And then there's also a statue that was given by the Virgin Islands to Denmark, a replication of their freedom statue that has now found a permanent home in Copenhagen.
So who was Josephine Baker, and what role does she play in your exhibit?
The very first part of the exhibit shows people like Josephine Baker, Coleman Hawkins, Fats Waller. It represents in the 30s and in the early years, a lot of people came to perform, including Louis Armstrong. They came, they performed, and then they left. And then later people started staying there permanently. So she was very popular. Josephine Baker came to Denmark several times. Through the 30s, there's a photograph of her later in the 50s getting an award at City Hall. So she really represents just the movement of the African Americans across Europe, but never made a home there. People started making homes in Scandinavia later, towards the 50s after World War II, when air travel became more common. So it was easier to go back home to see your family in the United States. But several of the expats, they lived more of their lives in Scandinavia than they did in the United States, and many of them became citizens. Now you can be a dual citizen in Denmark, but back then you couldn't. And so that meant they gave up their American citizenship, and they lived the rest of their lives in Scandinavia and died there.
Now, of course, Josephine Baker was a Black woman with roots in St. Louis who exiled to France and was decorated by the French government because of her role in the anti-Nazi resistance, and came back to the United States in the 1950s, where she fought Jim Crow. Speaking of which, the Black Angelino saxophonist Dexter Gordon has played in Denmark and has did live in Denmark. Talk to us about his role there.
He would arguably be one of the most famous of all the African-American jazz musicians, though he's not buried there. He lived there for about 12 years between 1960s and 1970s. He said it was his favorite city in the world. He would still go back pretty often. He went there on a whim. He was performing in England. He was invited to perform in Copenhagen, loved it. He stayed. There's actually a funny anecdote when he was reading an article about himself, and he was referred to as an expatriate. And he was thinking, am I an expat? He's like, I thought I was just living here. It just kind of just happened, and he ended up staying there for quite a while, and many other people followed. Kenny Drew left France and also lived in Denmark the rest of his life. He's buried behind Ben Webster, the same cemetery. And over the years, starting in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it kind of tapered off by 1980, other people started to follow, like Thad Jones, Ed Thigpen, a lot of the who's who, Horace Parlan. all of them went to Denmark.
Now, Ed Thigpen, as I recall, has roots in Los Angeles. Are there any other Black Angelenos who exiled in Denmark?
As far as I know, no. They both went to the same high school, but at different years. There's about 7 years between them. But most of the African Americans came from all over the United States. And I don't recall anyone else from Los Angeles besides those two.
How do you explain this Danish fascination with Black American music?
They love jazz. In Ken Burns' series on jazz, there's an excerpt about Louis Armstrong when he went to Denmark in the 1930s. It said 10,000 people showed up at the train station and all of his concerts sold out. And then the very last episode ends with Dexter Gordon. Well, it starts with Dexter Gordon playing at the Jazz House Montmartre that still exists. The jazz musician said that Denmark and the other Scandinavian countries, the people really knew a lot about jazz. They really respected the jazz musicians. They were able to go there and make a living. There was enough work for them. As Ken Burns' documentary says, in the 1960s, it was getting harder and harder for jazz musicians to make money. And so I think that's why a lot went over to Denmark. But they also liked the freedom. Sahib Shahab, who's in there, said, this racial bit depletes your energy. A lot of them were just able to focus on writing, composing, arranging, and they were more prolific during their years abroad than they were in the United States when they were fighting and struggling to get gigs and to get paid. The Danish government and other Scandinavian governments actually subsidized lots of the arts and lots of the jazz clubs so that people were paid right away.
Yes, you are hearing an interview with Professor Ethelene Whitmire of the African American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and historian professor Dr. Gerald Horne. And if you like this programming, we're going to take a pause from this so you can have a chance to pledge your support to the station because we are in fund drive. And so we just wanted to also make an appeal, about why you should donate as, in times of uncertainty, you might be listening to the station a little bit more than usual. And likely that's because you know that you can come here for essential information as well as for comfort and community. And the team at the station, it helps to keep you connected with information that you need as well as grounded when things feel less stable. And so here at KPFK, we're committed to keeping you in the loop and engaged. And so with all your appreciation, with KPFK, you can donate today as KPFK is made possible thanks to the generous support of listeners like you. So please give to keep it going. Your support makes a difference. Here's how to help. You can call 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK and pledge your financial support, or you can go online and do the same at kpfk.org. And so now we're going to return to the second half of our interview hosted by our co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne, in conversation with Professor Ethelene Whitmire of the African American Studies Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and co-editor of the book Nordic Utopia, African Americans in the 20th Century.
Any reflections on the other countries in that region and their experience with Black Americans, speaking of Finland, Sweden, Norway, for example?
A lot of the people, they either performed in the other Scandinavian or Nordic countries, or some of them moved between the two. And for example, Clifford Jackson, a painter, lived in Denmark, but then he ended up living and dying in Stockholm. In terms of the other ones, there's one artist, Howard Smith, that we have in Finland. Not sure there was anyone else. He liked it when he went over there and decided to live there since the 70s until his death recently in 2021. But he said, and other people said, there was something that was missing. Being around other Black Americans, there was something about being in the United States that they missed. And for example, Howard Smith left and he went back to the United States to work at Scripps College in California for 8 years. before he returned to spend the rest of his life in Finland. Or Dexter Gordon mentioned the happiest times were when he was in Denmark and he ran into other African Americans, or a lot of them would visit to perform. And he said there was just something about the Danish jazz musicians that just didn't have the same, I don't know if you want to call it soul, that they missed when they were playing with other African American artists. So while they loved the freedom and the ability to live where many people said they felt like a human being for the first time, they still were missing home, whether it was food, family, or just the African American culture. No one said they missed America per se, but very specifically, they missed African Americans.
What about Babs Gonzalez? Who was Babs Gonzalez and what role does he play in your pages?
We included him. Well, I included him. I just loved the photograph of him. You could tell that he was an interesting character. I didn't know exactly who he was. The photographs that are included by Babs Gonzalez were by Kristen Malone, who was a white Danish woman married to an African American expat, Skip Malone, who was a journalist. And I just like Babs Gonzalez's stance. And when I looked up more information about him, his name is not Babs Gonzalez, but he thought it sounded better to have a more Latino sounding name than his true African American name. He's from Newark, New Jersey. He's a singer, quite a character. He self-published books that he would sell at various jazz clubs. And I just liked including his photograph because it kind of captured, I don't know, something about him. You could tell again that he was a character, and he's downtown in Newhavn, one of the most famously photographed sections of Copenhagen. And then we include several other photographs of other jazz musicians, but mainly Dexter Gordon in the exhibit.
Now, what about the Black painters? Herb Gentry, William Henry Johnson, Walter Williams. Talk to us about them, their experiences, and how it may have differed from that of the musicians. And perhaps was there a difference in what attracted them to the, quote, Nordic Utopia, question mark, unquote, as opposed to other artists?
Yes, they were very different. Besides the jazz musicians who interacted with each other because they had to, because they played in bands, there were several big bands, some of them led by African Americans like Thad Jones. So they had a reason to interact. But a lot of the other African Americans who went there, like the dancer, the Crutchfield was included, and the painters you mentioned, a lot of them went for very different reasons. And while they were familiar with each other and they often bought each other's work and supported them, they didn't necessarily form a community. And I actually think many people went to Denmark because they wanted to be different, stand out a little bit. They weren't looking for a community like a lot of people did in Paris. So Herb Gentry, he's more associated with Paris. After World War II, he stayed in Paris. He used the GI Bill to study. But in the 50s and 60s, a lot of his friends said, you look too Algerian. It's dangerous for you to be in France. You should leave, according to his widow, Marianne Gentry. She said that he went to Sweden and then to Denmark because of those reasons. People like William Henry Johnson, he went to study art in France in the 30s, and he met and fell in love with a Danish woman, another artist, Holke Craik, and then he moved to Kerteminde, a little village far outside of Copenhagen. So he went there for love. He stayed there for 8 years. Walter Williams was one of the few people who actually had a connection to Denmark in terms of family. His grandfather was from the Danish West Indies, now the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so he chose to go to Denmark for that reason instead of going to France, where a lot of people studied. And he eventually fell in love with a Danish woman, and he has a son there. And he's like the jazz musicians. He was a middle-aged man. He had a wife and family, or ex-wife and family, back in the United States, and started a second family, often with a Scandinavian woman, and created new families.
Now, did any of these Black artists speak Danish?
Yes, actually, Skip Malone, who I mentioned before, was good friends with Dexter Gordon, and they actually studied together Danish through the government. And Walter Williams, he taught schools while he was there, art school, and some of the jazz musicians also taught school to supplement their income. And many of them could speak Danish. It's a very difficult language. And because of that, I think that's why they are so fluent. I rarely encountered anyone in my 14 years who couldn't speak English, but many of them talked about trying. Walter Williams said in letters to David Driscoll, he said, I can make myself understood. There's video of Dexter Gordon talking to an interviewer in Danish. And as is common, the Danish interviewer switched to English, but Dexter Gordon continued speaking in Danish and finally made a remark about how he's speaking Danish while the Danish interviewer is speaking English. But a lot of them learned enough to say, welcome, hello, goodbye, hope you enjoyed the evening, things like that.
Now, I take it that going to Denmark and to Scandinavia in general was a reaction to U.S. Jim Crow. So is it fair to assume that as Jim Crow begins to erode, that kind of exile simultaneously begins to erode, which leads me to the question, are there still Black artists in Denmark or in the other countries more generally?
I think things started to erode for some of those reasons, but also around the 1980s, it was more difficult for African Americans to be able, at least I'm more familiar with Denmark, to get visas to work there, as they wanted to privilege their own people in terms of working. And so it seemed harder and harder. Maybe people felt like they didn't need to immigrate, but immigration in the Nordic countries is not easy. And so right now, I haven't really encountered any African Americans artists or musicians. The people I have encountered who live there are computer scientists. Most of them are African Americans with PhDs, at the least a master's degree in art, or teachers, because they're looking for English speakers to teach the children of expats. But you have to have a high level of education or a special education right now. So the people I encounter now are just highly educated African Americans in sciences or engineering or architecture, not the musicians. They still have jazz festival every July for over 2 weeks. The city of Copenhagen is just filled with artists, and people like Lakeisha Benjamin was there this summer, Cecile McLaurin Savant, Michelle Ndege Ocello performed, and other African Americans. So they come and they go. So it's returning to the old model. People are not staying or immigrating there.
Finally, Ethelene Whitmire, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, co-editor of Nordic Utopia, African Americans in the 20th Century. What's next on your agenda?
Well, I have a literary agent, and I was wanting to publish a book about African Americans in Denmark. I have over 500 pages. I've traveled all over the country, following in the footsteps of people. But an agent asked me to focus on one story about an African American man, a very modest background from Boston, who ended up studying at Harvard for his bachelor's and master's in the 1930s. And late 1930s, he went to the Sorbonne to study, fell in love with a Danish man. They went to Denmark. World War II started. They fled to Italy, where they were captured by the Nazis. They did eventually escape, and they ran into African American troops with reporters embedded who recorded this story. And that's how I know this story. Met his family. He left behind 200 letters from his time in Paris, Copenhagen, and Florence. And I'm able to recreate this story. And it will be published in the future by Viking Books at Penguin Random House. So I'm concentrating on that book first, and then I want to finish the book about African Americans in Denmark.
Well, it seems like that may have some cinematic possibilities, Professor Whitmire.
Yeah.
In any case, thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And now we go to our prison radio segment. We do want to share, if you haven't already heard the news, that since August of this year, 12 black men at Virginia's Red Onion Supermax prison have self-emulated, which means they set themselves on fire in a desperate attempt to escape conditions that amount to prolonged torture. Most of its prisoners at Red Onion spend 23 hours in solitary confinement, and some of them for as long as 14 years. Red Onion has been known to use attack dogs on prisoners who speak out and organize against the abuse of the guards. So there's more information available online, and just be mindful that mainstream media has also been suppressing this coverage. All power to the people.
The election is several weeks behind us. Yet why does it seem so close, so heavy upon the hearts of millions? It is at the very heart of the feeling of despair that follows like a dark cloud. Some wonder, how did this happen? And of all the audiences affected by this debacle, few feel it as keenly as Black women, who must see this as a rejection of their very selves. For Kamala Harris, a lawyer and a high public official for years, was facing a figure decried as a convicted felon, a fraudster, and one found liable of sexual assault in a civil case. How could she not win? The election answered that question rather decisively. But why? I suspected that women, having lost their constitutional rights due to the overturning of Roe v. Wade, would ensure an overwhelming vote come election day. This didn't happen. The Israeli blitzkrieg against the occupied territory in Gaza also played a role. And a Jewish third-party candidate, Jill Stein, won some 18% of Michigan's voters, mostly Arab Americans, who bristled at Harris's defense of Israeli aggression as self-defense. Thirdly, in a community besieged by police repression, mass incarceration, and unfair sentencing and trials, a number of Black voters jumped ship and joined the GOP rather than voting for a Black prosecutor. Harris seemed to depend on suburban college-educated women to carry her over the rainbow, but it didn't happen. Fear, it seems, trumps, no pun intended, gender. The Democratic Party is in the wilderness right now, at least for the time being. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We want to thank our listeners who have already pledged this hour, and for those of you who are ready to support our fund drive, the number to call is 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735, and our website is www.kpfk.org. Again, you are tuned in to KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and 93.7 FM in San Diego. And, you know, this station is an essential resource. And so if it is that to you in your life, whether it is reliable information you can use or joyful music that inspires your community, this station provides you programming that you can rely on. And, you know, please know that you're an essential part of this station too. Listeners provide the funding that keeps the news, information, and arts alive. Listeners' money fuels the station's power to operate. And if you're going to continue to count on this station, please remember its staff and volunteers count on you, our listeners, and so your contribution this hour is so important as it enables this essential resource to provide vibrant radio. Here's how to help. You can make a pledge by calling 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK, or go online at kpfk.org.
This is Sister Flora, and you're listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is our sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Kellie Carter Jackson, Michael and Denise Kellen, 68, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, and author of the book, We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Carter Jackson.
Hi, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you. So why did you write this book, We Refuse?
I wrote this book because I was mad. I was really mad. I was sitting through the summer of 2020, known as sort of the summer of racial reckoning, and I just felt like everything that was happening was not a solution, was not sort of the path forward, and I was just frustrated. And Audre Lorde talks about how anger can be useful and how anger is information, and that anger can be powerful. And so I took pen to paper, started to write. At first it was an op-ed, and then after the op-ed came out, it kind of went viral, and people asked me, is this a book? And I said, Not, hadn't quite thought of it as a book at that moment, but very quickly, yeah, it became one, and this is the result.
So is there a gender component to Black resistance over the decades and centuries?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think in some ways you might say that resistance is not gendered at all, that anybody can sort of participate in their own resistance to white supremacy. But when I think of the story through the lens of the Black experience, I put women at the center of resistance. I think women are both sort of the architects of resistance and the foot soldiers of resistance, that they are always on the front lines. There's a reason there's a Black woman on the cover of my book. A lot of these stories tell the stories of Black women that are fighting back and that are actively refusing their own their oppression. And so for me, it's important to see that, because I think when we think about violence has a very sort of masculine framework to it. We think of men with guns, we think of men and their big muscles or whatever it is. But oftentimes it's women who are engaged in that work. And so I really wanted to call that out and to say that no, resistance is not necessarily gendered, but if we're going to talk about resistance, we have to put women at the forefront of it.
Talk to us more about the role of violence. And in that context, I detect in your pages a reevaluation of the hegemony of nonviolence as it's portrayed in the historiography. Is that a fair perception?
Yeah, I think that is a fair perception. You know, I got frustrated talking about nonviolence with my first book, Force and Freedom. I wrote about Black abolitionists and the politics of violence. And I don't think we give violence necessarily enough credit for its utility and its ability to accomplish purpose. I think oftentimes when we think of violence, we're only thinking of it in terms of something harmful, something terrible. But a lot of times Black people are up against a rock and a hard place. And by removing violence or force or defense off the table, you cripple people, you handicap them. And when I think about, the history of Black folks, and I look at all sort of like the pinpoints along a timeline, violence and force is always present. It is always there. And it's oftentimes a turning point, a shift in terms of how Black people understand their progress. If you think about the Civil War, it's one of the most violent wars to ever take place in American history. And we can't discount the role that violence played in bringing about emancipation, the 13th and 14th Amendment. Violence has a role to play. And I think instead of shying away from it, it's important to sort of tease it out and understand how it works, why it's used, when it's used, and what is its efficacy. And I think that sometimes we don't do enough of interrogating the limitations of nonviolence, the corollary of that. So what does it look like when nonviolence doesn't work? What does it look like when nonviolence is actually the tool of the oppressor, the only tool that he sort of allows you to use because he too believes that nonviolence is, impotent. So how do we really discuss that? These are questions that just have fascinated me in both my book projects and probably will for a long time to come.
Now, what about your great-grandmother, Arnesta, as you term her?
Yeah.
What role does she play in your pages?
So I opened the book telling a story about my great-grandmother, Arnesta, who was living in the South, and when she was 9 years old, she stepped on a rusty nail and it got infected and she almost died. And my great-great-grandmother took her to the only doctor she knew, a white man who lived in this big house on the other side of town, and said, "Will you please help my daughter?" And he offered to help her, but on the condition that once he healed her, Arnesta had to basically come and work and live with his family for the rest of her life. And this is in 1915, so slavery is like 50 years over. And this was sort of the ultimatum that he presented. And at first, Mary Bullard, who's my great-great-grandmother, she didn't want her daughter to die. This was her only child. And so she accepted the doctor's unconscionable terms. But it was her mother, whose name is lost to history, that intervened and said, "No, we refuse. I refuse." And picked up her ailing granddaughter, took her home, administered her aid, gave her every natural remedy she could possibly find. And she saved Arnesta's life. And for the rest of Arnesta's life, though, she walked with a limp. And I talk about this limp in this book as a violent racial imprint, that to be Black in America is to limp. And what does it mean to sort of have this remedy be sort of concocted out of these terms that Black people had to sort of refuse either a life in bondage in perpetuity or death? Those can't be the choices. And I love that my ancestor refused those options, that she carved out a space for her granddaughter, for my own existence for that matter. And yeah, the book really helps us understand what refusal can look like and how refusal is not just no, refusal is never.
So, speaking of violence, how do you assess the role of 1776 versus the Haitian Revolution in terms of advancing Black liberation?
Another good question. I think I wrote an op-ed about this not too long ago too, I think for the Boston Globe, but I talked about how the American Revolution is not really revolutionary. And I say that, and a lot of times people balk because they're like, "What do you mean? It's the American Revolution." And it's like, no, revolutions are meant to overthrow and replace broken systems with better ones, with just systems. That's how I define a revolution. And making life better should be the end goal or the result. But you don't get a better life for Black people after 1776. You don't get a better life for Native Americans or for women or for poor white farmers. So there's not much that's very revolutionary about it. You're really just sort of replacing a foreign leader with a local one. But the terms and the sort of status quo has not essentially changed. What I will argue, though, is that I think America was sort of conceived of in 1776, but it wasn't really born until 1861. I really see the Civil War as this turning point in which, with the abolition of slavery, with the granting of citizenship and the protection of rights and of suffrage, that's when you get revolutionary change in the United States. But the real revolution is actually sort of south of Florida, happening in Haiti. The Haitian Revolution set out to not just sever ties from France, but to really overthrow a horrific institution of slavery and to create a base for equality and citizenship and rights. And that ought to be our model when we think about what revolution means, especially to those who are oppressed.
You also, in your pages, Professor Carter Jackson, talk about the film Burn, starring Marlon Brando, as one of your favorite films. Why do you say that?
I love that film. It's so good. I mean, there's some stuff that's problematic about it. I mean, I teach it, so I have a critique of it as well. But I love the film because it's about this mythical island named Queimada. They don't call it Jamaica or Haiti or whatever. They make up the name of the island. And Marlon Brando comes as like this hired hand, this mercenary that's going to start this slave rebellion so that he can take the island out from the Portuguese and claim it for the British and sort of accomplish his own really, goals of empire and domination. And he picks this slave named Jose Dolores, who he believes will be the perfect rebel leader to kick off this slave rebellion so that the Portuguese can get kicked out. And what happens is this slave rebellion snowballs into a whole-on revolution. And Jose Dolores is no longer going to be a pawn used by the British to kick out the Portuguese, but he's taking over the island of Queimada, and he's on his own mission to free the enslaved and to start a new republic. And it goes through all of the phases of the moment you go from the rebellion to the revolution, but also thinking about like the nation and how do you make a nation? How do you build a republic, and how difficult it is to do that, and how hard it is to stop the people once they've been empowered. And it is such a powerful film. There's so many good lines in there. Like, one of my favorite lines is Jose Dolores, who's the rebel leader. He says, "It is better to know where to go and not know how, than how to go and not know where." And I think that line to me just represents so much of the Black struggle. I think Black people have always known where to go. We are going toward freedom, toward liberation. That's the goal. But how we get there, we haven't quite decided or come up with a plan of what's the best sort of roadmap or strategy to get there. And I think in the converse, for white people, they don't really know where they're going. They only know destruction and domination. That's their path, marching towards domination and destruction. And you have to ask yourself, like, to what end? Where are you going? What happens when there's genocide? What happens when everyone that you've exploited is no longer here? Now what? So these are really, I think, profound questions that we ought to all grapple with.
Speaking of grappling, what's next on the research agenda of Professor Carter Jackson?
So this book, the book we refused, was not even supposed to happen. Like I told you, it was the op-ed that became this thing. I had started writing in 2020 on a person that's sort of unknown, at least in the United States. His name is Joseph LaRoche, and he is known as the only Black passenger on the Titanic. And I really wanted to tell his story and the story of his descendants and how we think of, the obsession that we have with the Titanic. But when 2020 hit, it was the pandemic. I couldn't go abroad. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't do any of this research. And so Reba Few sort of became the placeholder for that book. But now I'm really excited because I'm back researching this book again, and it's so much more I'm finding about, it's more than just looking at, look, a Black person on a boat or a Black person on the Titanic. It's how do we think about the Titanic, and why do we think about it as much as we do, and how has the Titanic become sort of a metaphor for white supremacy, and our inability to relinquish the Titanic is because of our inability to relinquish the idea of whiteness as supreme. And so we come back to this again and again because the ship that wasn't supposed to ever sink is a lot of what white supremacy is, a ship that's not supposed to sink. And so what do we do when we think about race, and how does race complicate this story, this narrative? Not the fact that just Joseph is on there, but there are Chinese people on the boat, there are Japanese people on the boat, there are Portuguese people on the boat, there's Jews, there's all this sort of like mixing of nations and ethnicities. And when we talk about the ship, we never talk about race, only class. And I think that's the linchpin of the Titanic. It's whiteness and wealth. And so I really want to write this book to sort of tease out our obsession with these ideas.
Well, we look forward to that book, Professor Carter Jackson, teacher, professor at Wellesley College in Massachusetts, author of the book, We Refuse, A Forceful History of Black Resistance. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now, and we want to thank our listeners who have already pledged this hour, and for those of you who still want to donate at the end of our hour, and with our continuing program with our sister Sumta coming up next. The number to call is 818-985-KPFK. That's 818-985-5735 to support our KPFK fund drive. You can also donate on our website, kpfk.org. Community radio is more than radio. This station is a look at our community. We come together to be informed, entertained, and enlightened, and what you get on this station is greater than what you'll find on social media or streaming services. And that's because the station is committed to community first. I'm here to remind you that you rely on this station for news, music, and culture. You value community radio for enhancing your town as a place you love. Now is a good time to support this nonprofit station with a financial contribution, and donations from people like you make this station possible. So again, here's how to help. To make a pledge, call 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK, or go online to kpfk.org. And in closing, we want to thank our guests. Thank you, Dr. Ethelene Whitmire. Thank you, Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, our board op Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. Signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.